Mississippi, 1854. A storm was forming over the Carter plantation, but not in the sky. It was inside the house, behind locked doors, at a long oak table where power was always served before food. Captain William Carter sat at the head, his jaw tight, his eyes heavy with pride and cruelty. He was not a man who asked. He was a man who commanded, and his word was law. Beside him sat his daughter, Margaret Carter, 19 years old, weighing nearly 200 kilograms. Her body was a subject of mockery and whispers and cruel jokes behind lace fans. She had never known affection, never felt desired glances, never been more than a shadow trailing behind her father's dominance. And tonight, Captain Carter was determined to erase his shame in the most brutal way possible. At the far end of the room stood Josiah, a slave barely older than Margaret, his wrists scarred from iron, his back a canvas of whips. His eyes did not lift, his voice did not dare rise. Yet he was the center of the storm, because Captain Carter had decided that Margaret would marry him. The room froze at the announcement. Servants lowered their eyes. Margaret's lips trembled, her hands clawing at the fabric of her dress, as if it could hide her from what she had just heard. Josiah remained motionless, his chest rising and falling in quiet defiance. Captain Carter's voice was steel. "You will be wed. Tonight the shame of this house ends." Margaret could not breathe. She had grown up obeying, never once stepping out of the path her father carved. But this was not obedience. This was humiliation painted as order. "Father, please." Her voice cracked, soft, desperate, but Carter's gaze silenced her. "You are my blood, and I will not have my blood mocked by this town any longer. They laugh at you, Margaret. They laugh at me. But tomorrow they will see you as a wife, a woman with a husband. That is all that matters." The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the steady hum of cicadas outside and the slow drip of rain against the shutters. Inside, Margaret's world shattered. She glanced at Josiah, the man forced into this fate alongside her. Their eyes met for a single heartbeat, hers wide with terror, his deep with something else. Not pity, not anger. Something darker. Something unreadable. By candlelight, the plantation gathered. Slaves stood in the back, eyes lowered, hands folded, forced witnesses to their own degradation. The preacher arrived, a man whose hands trembled as he held his Bible. He had been called, not invited. And no man refused. Captain Carter. Margaret was dressed in white. The dress strained against her body, seemed screaming as if the fabric itself resisted this union. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. She held no flowers, no ring, no veil. Only shame. Josiah stood opposite her, his wrists bound even during the ceremony. His voice was never asked for. His consent was never considered. The vows were spoken, the words twisted by the weight of chains. When the preacher's voice faltered, Captain Carter's fist slammed against the table. "Read it," he barked, and the preacher obeyed. When the final words fell into the thick Mississippi air, husband and wife, the silence was deafening. Margaret's hands shook. Josiah did not move. The slaves in the back held their breath, and Captain Carter smiled. For the first time in months he smiled. That night the house was darker than usual. Servants whispered in the halls, horrified at what had just been forced upon them. Margaret sat in her room, staring at the walls, her body heavy with despair. She had been chained to a man not by love, but by her father's pride. Josiah was led into the quarters beside hers. Guards laughed, joking crudely about what would happen between them. But Josiah remained silent. His silence was heavier than any word. It was the silence of a man who had nothing left to lose, and Margaret knew it. When she finally gathered the courage to face him, she found not hatred in his eyes, but something sharper resolve. "You don't have to look at me," she whispered, tears streaking her face. Josiah's reply was soft, almost broken. "I don't see you. I see him." Her heart sank, because she understood. She was not a wife. She was a weapon. And tonight Josiah was already planning what to do with the blade Captain Carter had placed in his hands. The night deepened. The rain fell harder, and in the Carter house a storm unlike any Mississippi had ever seen was about to break loose, because marriages born in cruelty do not end in peace. They end in blood. The rain did not stop. It came down like a curtain, hiding the house from the road and the road from the sky. Somewhere in that blackness frogs sang like a choir that didn't know it was singing at a funeral. Inside the candles burned low, and the Carter name hung in the air like smoke that couldn't find a window. Margaret hadn't slept. She sat upright on the edge of her bed, hands folded, dress still wrinkled from a wedding that wasn't a wedding, vows that weren't vows. She could hear the men outside laughing when they changed guard boots on boards, the clink of a flask, a joke that died in throats. On the other side of the thin wall, Josiah, breathing, not pleading, not moving, just breathing, a slow tide that told the room he was still there. When the lock turned, she didn't flinch. She had expected her father. Instead, the door opened only an inch, then stopped, careful as a thought that didn't want to wake anyone. A hand slid through. It wasn't a guard's hand. There were no rings, no tobacco stains. A woman's hand. Then a whisper that barely shaped the air. "Miss Margaret? The scullery girl? Ruth? 17? Too small for her chores, too old for the things she'd seen." Her eyes were big enough to hold the whole house, and still have room for a secret. "Speak," Margaret said, and the voice that came out of her was not the voice of last night. It was lower, steadier, as if the storm had burned out half her fear and left only ash. Ruth glanced over her shoulder, then slipped inside and closed the door with a soft back kiss of wood on wood. She held out a bundle wrapped in a flour sack. Inside, bread, a strip of bacon, a small knife with a worn bone handle, and at the very bottom keys. From where? Margaret asked. Ruth didn't answer. Not with words. She stared at the wall that separated this room from the next, the room where a man who had been turned into a husband without being asked was breathing like a secret someone meant to keep. Ruth's jaw worked. Her eyes asked a question she couldn't afford to speak. "Will you use them?" Margaret's fingers found the cold weight of the keys. They were heavier than they looked, heavier than a last name. "Come back before the bell," Margaret whispered. "If you're not here, don't come back at all." Ruth nodded once, sharp, and vanished like a thought you can't prove you had. The clock in the hall called 2, then 3. Time lost its shape. Somewhere in the house a door slammed, and the house shivered from roof to root. Margaret stood, the floor complaining under her weight. She crossed the room and pressed her palm to the wall. She could feel the breath on the other side. Josiah. No answer. Then a whisper as thin as the edge of a blade. I hear you. I have keys. A silence like a held breath. Then he will kill you. Margaret closed her eyes. He already did. The lock to Josiah's room complained. Metal against metal, a sound that meant permission and punishment at once. When the door opened, he did not step forward. He stood as if the floor might break under him. His wrists were raw where the rope had remembered him. She handed him the knife first. Not the keys. A test. He did not reach for her. He did not run. He took the knife the way a starving man accepts a crust carefully, as if life could change its mind. Why? He asked. Margaret's throat worked. Because I'm tired of being a cage someone else lives in. His silence was not agreement, not gratitude. It was calculation, a machine coming awake in the dark. The next key fit the next door. The corridor beyond smelled of floor wax and whiskey. Rain skated down the window glass and drew maps of countries no one would ever visit. They moved like ghosts. Margaret's breath became something she carried instead of something that controlled her. Josiah walked half a step behind, not because she led, but because noise has a shape, and he wanted to anchor to it. They passed the nursery no child had ever used, the parlor where her father taught men to obey him without raising his voice, the library where words grew sharp enough to cut rope. At the end of the hall, the door to the master's room shut, but not quiet. A sound inside, not snoring, a breath that had chosen to pretend it was sleep. Not yet, Margaret whispered. Josiah's hand hovered, the knife barely an idea. He nodded. They moved on. On the back stairs, the air found its courage and turned cold. Another door. Another lock that wanted to tell on them. It opened into the yard where the rain had hollowed paths between the outbuildings. The bell tower stood black against a sky without stars. The overseer's quarters were dark. Men who drink to forget rarely remember to wake. Farther away, the slave cabins hunched low, roofs slick and shining. Where? Margaret asked, the word stealing heat from her mouth. The pen, Josiah said. The barn. You mean to run? He shook his head. I mean to end. The barn loomed the place where animals slept, and men were made to kneel. Josiah slipped inside first, then pulled her after, hand to palm. The smell was hay and iron and old blood. The kind of smell a body knows before it learns words for it. Here, he said, and bent to the dirt. He set the knife down. He began to dig with both hands, not for long, not deep. He pulled up a wrapped bundle, oil-soaked cloth, heavy, careful. He opened it the way a man opens a letter that can change the shape of a life, inside. A bell clapper the iron heart ripped from the plantation's throat. 2 weeks earlier, the bell had gone silent for a day, and the men swore the rope had slipped. It hadn't. Josiah had been busy. Next to the clapper, a small tin of powder that did not belong to the kitchen, and 3 nails bent straight again. You stole from him, Margaret said. No, Josiah answered. I returned it. The word did something to the air between them. Gave it edges. Gave it memory. How many will help you? She asked. Enough, he said. Enough to make him choose what to fear most, the dark or the people he put in it. She looked at the tin in his hand. "You'll burn the house." He shook his head. "No fire. Not yet. Fire tells a story too fast. Tonight we make him listen." The plan was not spoken like a blueprint. It unfolded like a prayer, piece by piece, image by image. The bell would ring without its heart. Josiah had forged a new clapper from scrap and spite, and it would ring at an hour that meant only one thing on a plantation like this: uprising. The guards would run to the wrong place. The men and women in the cabins would be waiting, not with muskets. They didn't need them, but with time. Every chain has a blind spot. Every yard has a corner where the light forgets to look. Josiah had measured them all. "And me?" Margaret asked. He looked at her then, not past her, not through her. "You will keep him in one place." "How?" "You are the only thing he cannot move." The words hit her like truth hits a bruise. She nodded once. The decision inside her finished forming. They stepped back out into the rain. It had soft, a whisper instead of a threat. Dawn was still a rumor on the edge of the world. Josiah vanished into the dark with a promise that sounded like a vow and a warning. "When you hear the bell, speak." "Speak what?" "The thing he fears." She walked back alone, carrying keys that knew every sound she made. The hall watched her pass with the smugness of wood that had held too many secrets. She stopped at the master's door and laid her ear against it. The breath inside had changed. The sleep was gone. He was waiting for the house to bow when he stood. She opened the door without knocking. William. Carter was a man who had learned early that fear is cheaper than love. He sat upright, hair in disarray, shirt loose at the throat. The pistol on the nightstand was closer than the Bible. He looked at his daughter, as if she were a servant who had forgotten how to bend. "You are out of place," he said. "I'm exactly where you put me," she answered. And the voice in the room was not the voice of a girl who wore seams that fought her. It was a bell before it rings. His eyes flicked to the window, to the door, to the clock that couldn't make its hands matter. "Where is he?" "Alive," she said. "For now." He stood, the floor complaining under him. "You have no idea what you've done." Margaret took a breath that had a past in it. "I was a problem you tried to solve by making me uglier. You thought if I wore shame like a dress, it would make you lighter. It didn't." He smiled then, the kind of smile a knife makes when it thinks it's alone. "You think the town will accept you now? A spectacle with a husband no one will maim? I fixed your life. You're welcome." The words were oil on water, pretty, poisonous, impossible to drink. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain. The yard was a smear of wet charcoal. "Listen," she said. He stilled. There was nothing to hear. Then the bell rang not once, not twice. It rang with a voice the house did not recognize, a voice made from iron that had learned humility and forgot to be polite. It rang a pattern men know in their bones when they live by someone else's rules. "Gather." Now William Carter went pale. "What have you done?" Margaret didn't answer. The bell kept speaking. In the yard, boots hit mud. Shouts overlapped. The guards ran toward the bell tower because that's where fear told them to go. The cabin's doors opened in unison, not in panic, but in a rhythm someone had taught them. The house inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Carter reached for the pistol. Margaret put her hand over it and didn't move. He stared at the hand as if weight were a new language. "Sit," she said. It took him a heartbeat too long to understand she wasn't asking. "Do you think I won't?" "Shoot me, and you'll never know who else has keys," she said. "And you will die in a house that won't say your name again." He sat. The chair bit the floor. Downstairs doors opened. Men who had learned to step softly stepped loud. Josiah entered the front hall without sneaking. He didn't need to. He carried no torch. Only the clapper's echo, still ringing inside people who had never been allowed to ring. The overseer barreled in from the yard with 2 men behind him, mouths ready to shout, hands ready to grab. They stopped because the room in front of them had changed shape. The slaves did not cower. They stood, not close enough to be brave, not far enough to be afraid. The distance of exactly what happens when a man has done his math. "Back to your cabins," the overseer barked. No one moved. Ruth stood near the foot of the stairs, small as badly kept promises, eyes level. Josiah's voice did not rise. "He's upstairs," he said. "Let him come down." The overseer spat on the floor to make a point smaller than his spit. He grabbed Ruth by the arm to drag the point across her skin. The house leaned forward to see if it would allow the next thing. Someone took the overseer's wrist. Not Josiah, one of the carpenters, a man whose hands built other men's futures for free. The overseer stared at the hand on him as if it were smoke with fingers. Then he reached for his pistol and found it wasn't there. Another man held it, already open, the powder removed, the barrel stuffed with wet rag. Guns lose their courage when it rains. The overseer understood a new math. He stepped back. He raised his voice to call for the master and learned the house would not carry it. Upstairs, William Carter watched his kingdom turn into a voting booth where everyone had a hand. He stood to leave. Margaret moved with him. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. The door would not open unless she let it. "You think they'll follow him?" Carter asked, chin toward the staircase that held a different future on every step. "He's nothing. I bought him by the pound." "Then why are you afraid?" she asked. He licked his lips. The bell stopped. The silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of all the things that could happen next. "Call them off," he said, and the sentence revealed something he had never said out loud. "You have power I gave you by accident." "I can't," she said. "They didn't come for me." Josiah stepped into the doorway, rein still on his shoulders, eyes steady. He did not look at the pistol. He did not look at the Bible. He looked at the man who had tasted the world and decided only one mouth deserved to eat. "William Carter," he said, and the master flinched because his name had never sounded like a verdict before. "You took from me until you believed there was nothing left to take. You were wrong. You'll be hunted," Carter hissed. "Every county, every road, every man with a badge and a rope." "Then let them hear this," Josiah said. He did not raise his voice. "Tonight you forced a sacred thing and broke it in your hands. You put your daughter in a cage and called it a carriage. You married me to shame and thought it would breed. But shame dies when it's named." Margaret felt the room tilt, not because she was falling, but because the floor had finally admitted the truth of what it was holding. Carter moved toward the netstand. Not the pistol. He knew that theater needed an audience, and this room would not clap. He reached for the small brass bell that summoned servants, the one that used to pull feet across floors like strings on a puppet. He rang it. It made a sound like a memory, small and out of tune. No one came. He rang it again. Nothing. He stared at the bell, then at his daughter, then at the man he had called Nothing. He opened his mouth for the speech that had always saved him, the one where he turned words into fences. It didn't come. He had spent them. Choose, Josiah said. Carter laughed then, a short, brittle thing. Between what? Between owning and leaving. You can't leave what you own. You never owned what matters, Josiah said. A heartbeat stretched. The rain thinned to a mist. From below, the quiet creaked. The house was listening. Walk out, Margaret said to her father, and the steadiness in her voice surprised even the wall. Walk out alone. No men, no guns. If you can do that, you will live long enough to learn what your name sounds like when you say it without anyone else's mouth. He stared as if the words were a language he had fired from the staff years ago. And if I don't? Then stay, Josiah said, and hear your last prayer. Carter swallowed. Pride is a bone some men choke on. He set down the bell. He did not look at the pistol. He looked at the door, at the hallway, at the staircase crowded with people who had iron in their eyes and rope nowhere in their hands. The road beyond the yard was mud. The town was farther than his breath. But he could still walk, and you cannot own a man who knows how to choose a direction. He stepped past Josiah, past Margaret. He did not meet their eyes. He walked into the hall as if it still belonged to him. The house did not argue. It simply remembered. On the staircase, the overseer moved to block him, and then remembered he had somewhere else to be. The men made a corridor wide enough for fear to fit through. Carter reached the door. Ruth opened it. He paused at the threshold, became a memory of himself, then crossed into the rain dot. No one followed. The door shut. The lock turned. But the lock was not for him. It was for the house, to keep it inside itself long enough to decide what it wanted to be. In the silence that followed, breath by breath, the plantation put down weight it had carried for years. Someone laughed once and then stopped, as if the sound might be mistaken for celebration. No one celebrated. There was work to do, not fields, not cotton. Work with a different harvest. Fire? One man asked. No, Josiah said. Not today. His eyes found Margaret's. Tomorrow there will be questions. Papers. Men who make rules and forget to feed them. When they come, they will try to name what happened. We will already have chosen our answer. What answer? Ruth asked, voice barely more than a thread. Josiah looked at the staircase, at the rooms, at the faces that held both sunrise and smoke. That we were witnesses, he said. Not criminals, not property, witnesses, to a man who left his house because it would no longer hide him. The bell outside swung once in the wind. No sound. Its heart was in Josiah's pocket. Morning arrived with the courage of a thin light. The road held the prints of a man who had run out of directions. At the edge of the yard, the post that had once held a chain looked smaller. The fields kept their counsel. The cabins stood like people who had learned to breathe, standing up by noon. Two riders appeared neighbors in coats that thought they could make decisions. They asked questions the way men ask when they believe the answers will be afraid of them. The story they heard was simple. The captain left before dawn. He was not chased. No, there was no violence. Yes, the bell rang. No, no one knows why. The riders looked at the faces and heard what they did not see. The shape of the truth does not change when you lean on it. They left with rain on their hats and confusion in their pockets. By sundown, the house had learned a new sound. It was not laughter. Not yet. It was the sound of people talking without asking permission from their own mouths. Ruth moved through rooms with a different gait, like a bird that had discovered it could land anywhere. The overseer packed a bag and discovered the road had no room for him. No one stopped him from finding a ditch and deciding to become smaller dot in the dark. Josiah and Margaret stood in the doorway where the master had lost his title. They looked at the yard, at the bell tower, at a sky that no longer leaned. "What am I to you?" she asked, and the question contained all of last night and some of tomorrow. He answered without softening it. "Not a wife, not a weapon, a witness." She nodded. The word fit. It filled corners. It opened windows. "Will he come back?" she asked. "Yes," Josiah said. Pride is a road that always circles. She breathed in, out. "And when he does?" Josiah let the silence hold that question up to the light. "Then we show him what the house learned while he was gone. They did not touch. They did not need to. The night made a promise to the morning it had not met yet." Weeks later, a letter arrived from a town 2 counties over. No name on the outside. Inside, a line in a hand that didn't trust itself. "I am alive." There was no apology. Men like William Carter do not bend where apologies live. There was only a confession disguised as news. "I have nothing." The signature had been rubbed out until the paper almost tore. The message remained. A man who had bought a world and sold himself to keep it had walked out of the only place that would have him. He had left his house and could not find another one that would call him by his first name. The letter went into a drawer. The drawer learned to keep quiet. There were visits. Officials with questions. Pastors with advice. Merchants with suggestions that sounded like chains polished until they looked like bracelets. The house listened, nodded in the right places, agreed to the parts that didn't matter, and did not move. The bell stayed silent. The fields grew or didn't. Weather has its own politics. People slept and woke and found that breathing is different when it cannot be taken away. On a Sunday, long after the rain had taught the dust some manners, Margaret stood on the porch while the air learned to be gentle. Children ran in a yard that had recently remembered it was a yard. Ruth laughed for the first time like a sound that didn't know it could stop. Josiah fixed a hinge that had always complained, and for the first time accepted a thank you that had no weight attached. "Tell me the story," a child said to Margaret, fearless in the way only people born after storms can be. "Tell me the one about the man who had to leave his house because it wouldn't let him be loud." Margaret smiled, not because it was funny, but because the words were right. "It's not a story yet," she said. "We're still making it. And that is the part people will argue about when they talk about the Carter place years from now. Some will say the house burned. It didn't. Some will say the captain came back with men and ropes. He didn't, at least, not while the bell kept its silence. Some will insist a marriage happened and stayed. It didn't, not in any way a heart would sign. What happened was smaller and larger, a decision, a door opening, a man walking out, a name losing its grip on the air dot. As for what became of William Carter, there are versions. He died in a boarding room where no one knew the price of his land. He started over somewhere that didn't ask what kind of man he had been to build what he had. He drank himself into a story that only he could hear. Choose the version you need. The truth is not a hammer. It's an incline. You feel it in your steps. What remains certain is this: a bell without a heart taught a house how to listen. A woman the world called too much learned the exact weight of her voice. A man the world called nothing picked up silence and made it into law. And the night the storm came, the only fire was the kind that stays in the chest and refuses to let the cold back in, because sometimes justice does not clap. It does not roar. It does not leave a mark anyone can frame. Sometimes justice is just a door opening and a foot choosing a direction. And sometimes the loudest thing a house will ever hear is its own name refusing to answer when the wrong man calls.